Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. I am Vince D'Addario, the football analyst here at irishbreakdown.com, and with me, as always, is Brian Driscoll, the publisher at irishbreakdown.com. And Brian, I don't know why it catches me by surprise every single time we do a podcast, but my watch goes off and tells me that we're going live every time. And I'm like, whoa, what's going on? Oh, we're going live every single time. Eventually, maybe I'll get used to it. But we are here today, Brian, to have an interesting conversation. We're going to talk about expectations for this year's team, and we're going to go after it from kind of a national standpoint, talk about, what we think about that opinion. Is it valid? Is it not valid? And then we're going to give kind of at the end what our actual expectations are for this team going into 2021. Some very interesting opinions out there in the football landscape, Brian.
Yeah, and look, this is kind of a kickoff to what we're doing at irishbreakdown.com, which is, look, we're just a little over 90 days from Notre Dame's kickoff. We're about less than 2 weeks away from the entire team being back on campus and starting summer school and summer workouts and those type of things. And so, college football magazines are out. I got my Athlon the other day. I didn't even know it was out yet. I was walking around the grocery store and I saw it and I almost lost my mind. And so I got all fired up and I was like, yes, let's go. So I was very, very, very fired up about that. And, and look, we're really starting to ramp up that coverage of this upcoming team. And so we've already started some position previews on the podcast, but we're really going to start diving into things as we kick off of our summer schedule. And so that's really where this came from. We actually were planning to do this show. I scheduled this podcast to be on this topic last night. And then of course the ESPN S&P Plus thing comes out today, which we'll get into a little bit, but which was just absurdity. But everybody knows how much I hate the S&P Plus. It's a useless thing to do. So, but I think it's interesting because it just shows where Notre Dame is from a perception standpoint. And some of the perception is built on understandable aspects of what Notre Dame has done up to this point in time, but also what Notre Dame has failed to do up to this point in time. So this is going to be a look at what others are saying about Notre Dame,
right?
Which of the criticisms have some validity to them,
Mm-hmm.
Which of the criticisms we don't think we're buying, and we think that maybe this is more about them just not being as familiar with Notre Dame's roster as they should be, and some of that is true. So that's what we're going to do today. Is we're just going to kind of dive over what the expectations are, why we're not buying some of this stuff, and why some of these expectations are just ridiculous. So that's where we're at, and of course, we appreciate you being a part of the show. I got my Gap Closers gear.
Yeah,
that came in this weekend. I'm fired up about that. So got the Gap Closers hoodie, got the Gap Closers t-shirt, and got the Notre Dame long sleeve, the Irish Breakdown long sleeve t-shirt too. So, and we've had a dozen people already have ordered gear just since we launched late last week. So very excited about that, and appreciate all the support that y'all have given us. But you can find the link to that, the merch store, in the below here in the podcast. So it's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm excited. And if you have ordered gear, what I would love to see is when you get it, rock it and tweet it out. I want to see it. So I definitely want to see it. So I appreciate everybody being a part of that. But Vince, let's kind of dive into this. Let's really start looking at what those expectations are that people have for Notre Dame, and just really dive into it and analyze, where they're right or where those concerns are legitimate, and where maybe those concerns are going to look kind of silly when the season's over with. At least they should.
They should, in for what we expect, right? So, expectations as far as rankings are concerned. Let's start there, because it's kind of, I don't want to say all over the board, but we've seen Notre Dame ranked anywhere from 8 to 15, more or less.
Anyone legitimate.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
S&P Plus. Not legitimate.
Not legitimate. Sorry. But Yahoo has Notre Dame at 8. SI has them at 10. Athlon has them at 12. ESPN, I think, is the low man on the totem pole. Has Notre Dame at 15.
And that was from their way too early top 25. They haven't necessarily released an updated, but that way too early was before certain guys left for the NFL. I believe so. It's going to be interesting.
So let's just talk about that for starters, right? Let's talk about the rankings, what that means for Notre Dame. Does it matter that they're ranked on an average of 10-ish? Like, is that where you would rank them? Just kind of give me your opinions on the rankings in general, and then I'll give you mine.
For me, Vince, I don't think rankings matter as much as they used to, because rankings, and this has been proven accurate in every single year of the college football playoff. The preseason rankings and the AP poll, even the updated AP poll after week 10, 11, 12, don't have much of a bearing on what the college football playoff committee is going to do. We have also seen in 2 of Notre Dame's best seasons ever, they started unranked or ranked pretty low.
Yeah.
They weren't ranked very high in 2000. Actually, they were unranked in 2012 and ended up playing for the national championship. So they don't mean a whole lot practically. I think more of it is about the perception of the program. Now, where that can matter is, look, there's still some things when it comes to recruiting where it matters. But from a practical standpoint, Vince, there's not a whole lot that this is going to impact the season, other than just from a ranking standpoint. There's some teams you're going to have to jump ahead of. For me, it's more of just a arguing what the expectation should be for Notre Dame from a picture of, are they in a rebuilding mode, or are they in a reloading mode? The perception around the country from non-Notre Dame people, and I don't know about other Notre Dame writers, I'm just talking about us.
Yeah.
And the Notre Dame fans we engage with is, you're going into year 12 of the Brian Kelly tenure, and all these people tell us how great Brian Kelly is. And then they say, but, Notre Dame's going to take a bigger drop off this year than Ohio State, Georgia, Clemson, Alabama, Oklahoma. And 2 of those programs, Ohio State and Alabama, lost more players in the NFL than Notre Dame did, and more even higher level players in the NFL than Notre Dame did. Georgia lost the same number of guys that they did. And you can talk about the impact of players that Notre Dame lost, but nobody lost a better 1-2 punch, in my opinion, than Trevor Lawrence and Travis Etienne at Clemson.
Sure.
And you're not seeing them getting dropped the way that Notre Dame was dropped. And so that's where I'm at, Vince. Is I think to me, Notre Dame should be a top 10 team. If you have Notre Dame 10 or higher, I can mess with you. I think we're talking to where maybe degrees are different, but we're having the same conversation. We're talking about the same team.
Right.
If you're getting down to 12 and 15, I don't know what you're looking at. But the bigger issue for me, Vince, isn't necessarily where Notre Dame is ranked as much as it's who was ranked ahead of them in some of these instances.
Yeah.
And that's where, to me, that's where I get a little bit of a, okay, yeah, I get Notre Dame being 8th, but you're going to put that team, and that team ahead of Notre Dame?
And I think that's the bigger issue here.
Yeah.
I just, and you can call it disrespect. You can call it whatever you want. You can call it clickbait for that matter, because I think some of it is that. But I have an issue with who is ranked about, around Notre Dame for sure. I think North Carolina is getting an awful lot of love. And look, they've had really good recruiting classes. I get that. But Notre Dame's had pretty decent recruiting classes too.
Better than North Carolina's.
And if we're talking about what you lost going into this year, North Carolina lost more offensively than Notre Dame did.
Maybe not numbers of starters, but far as the impact of the production that they lost, right?
The 2 running backs, the top 2 receivers, you lose those 4 guys. Yes, you're bringing back a pretty darn good quarterback. I get that. And Notre Dame lost their quarterback. Okay. But Notre Dame smashed North Carolina with those guys last year. And we're not taking that into account either, which I have a big problem with. So I don't –
The other part of that too, Vince, about North Carolina specifically is the impacts that the losses that North Carolina had on offense should hurt more than the Notre Dame losses on offense. Correct. Because North Carolina is an offensive – they're built on their offense. Notre Dame is not. Notre Dame is built on their defense.
Correct.
And Notre Dame has more starters coming back than starters lost on defense.
And
which was the strength
of last year.
Right.
And and we're going to get into, the losses and things like that. And you kind of echoed, who they've lost in the past. And yeah, they lost some guys on offense. There's no question. Yeah. But anybody that's going to walk up to me and tell me that Notre Dame won all their games because of their offense last year, I'm just going to smack you right in the face.
Right.
Like, wake up, man. Wake up.
Right.
Notre Dame did not win their games because of their offense last year. They won it because of their defense. Okay. And so, they lost 4 offensive linemen. No doubt. That's something that they need to look at. But that is not the only reason that Notre Dame should be dropped off the face of the earth, which is what some of these people are doing. So,
and there's an assumption that those losses are going to hurt Notre Dame more than they hurt other teams.
Yes.
That's the thing.
That's
that
a bigger issue.
Pick up on it.
They don't think Notre Dame is reloading.
Right.
They think that Notre Dame is rebuilding. And
at
the end of the day, if they're ranked 10-ish, they still have everything in front of them.
Right.
Because if you remember that graphic that we saw, the games that are going to impact, the college football playoff or whatever, didn't Notre Dame have like 3 or 4 of those? Yeah. So the Cincinnati game, the Wisconsin game, the USC game, and the North Carolina game. Does that sound right?
Yeah. Cincy, North Carolina, USC, and Wisconsin. Yep.
Okay. So 3 of those are home games, and one's a neutral site in Chicago, which might as well be a home game for Notre Dame.
That's a Notre Dame town.
I'm just saying Notre Dame hasn't lost at home since 2017?
Yeah. And that was a 1-point loss to the eventual national runner-up.
Yeah, I'll take my chances in those quote-unquote big games.
And none of the analysts talk about that. I have not seen one person write about the fact that Notre Dame doesn't lose at home anymore.
Right.
I haven't seen one person write about, you know what, Notre Dame's schedule is, and we'll get into the schedule a little bit, is a little tougher this year, but most of their toughest games are at home. Nobody's talking about that, which again shows me that there's not necessarily the thorough dive that they're doing into Notre Dame that, in my opinion, you should be doing.
Correct.
And so I think there's still a lot of assumptions about what Notre Dame was before that are being held against them that to be honest with you, shouldn't be held against them. And look, as far as the personnel losses, I think number one, I mean, yes, this is the most the NFL draft picks that Notre Dame has lost.
Sure.
I would argue, however, that part of the reason Notre Dame had 9 players drafted is because their perception has changed in the last 4 years. And you look at, for example, what Notre Dame lost from the 2017 team that went 10-3. They lost a pair of top 10 NFL draft picks in Quentin Nelson and Mike McGlinchey. They lost Durham Smythe, who was a 4th-round draft pick, Equinemi St. Brown, who was a 6th-round draft pick, and their leading receiver, and Josh Adams went undrafted. Josh Adams rushed for over 1,400 yards that year.
Right.
Defensively, they lost Niles Morgan, they lost Greer Martini, they lost Jay Hayes, they lost Nick Watkins. That team lost quite a bit of talent as well, and not only did they maintain what they had done the year before, they were better record-wise.
Right.
Now, I think that somewhat needs to be understood of they played a much tougher schedule in 2017 than 2018.
Sure.
But Notre Dame went out in 2018 and went undefeated in the regular season and beat 3 ranked opponents. You look at 2019, I would argue that the especially from a skill position standpoint, yes, Notre Dame. Oh, and by the way, that 2017 team also lost Harry Heastan.
True.
Right. So you had some guys coming back. And in 2018, you lost Alex Bars in the 5th game of the year. So you didn't have Alex Bars for 2 or 3 opponents against, 2 or 3 games against ranked opponents. So that's something else that needs to be taken into consideration. In 2018, you also lost Sean Crawford. Now, you didn't lose him from a graduation, but Sean got hurt in, I believe, fall camp in 2018, right? Because in 2017, Sean was a very important part of what Notre Dame was doing. Yeah. He was their nickel. You think of that strip against Michigan State. So he wasn't considered a lost starter in the traditional sense, but he was another player that Notre Dame lost from that team. So that team had heavy personnel losses. You look at last year, and you look at the fact that Notre Dame lost Chase Claypool, Cole Kmet, Chris Fink, their leading rusher, Tony Jones Jr. You look at Julian Akwara, Khalid Kareem, Troy Pride, Alohi Gilman, Jalen Elliott, Osmar Bilal. So they lost 6 starters from their defense, and they are a defensive-oriented team, and yet their defense was every bit as good this upcoming season. And there's some other things that they're not talking about that we'll get into in this show, but then also here in a show coming up, which is about there's not a lot of context being looked at in these preseason rankings, which is another problem that I have.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I guess I just have a problem with people just not doing their homework because it's not like it's hidden homework. It's not like we follow a team like Tulane that Oh, I just pulled that name out of the hat, so I apologize if I'm insulting any Tulane fans out there. But it's not like there's a lack of information out there on these teams. I mean, it's not difficult to figure out what the depth chart is at Notre Dame and what their recruiting rankings were, or whatever the case may be, the coaching situation. I have a problem with these blanket statements about Notre Dame. And about what they're going to be this year based on last year. I just it's lazy to me. And I'm sorry.
I think it's I'm with you.
It's lazy. And I will also agree that it is clickbait material, because there's a lot of really passionate Notre Dame fans out there, which is one of the reasons I love being a Notre Dame fan and covering the team. There's passion out there. And so we can have spirited conversations and we can disagree and have some fun with it. But that's across the country. And when people see that 7-5, for example, prediction, they're going to click on that because they want to get mad at the guy who did it, and then there's all the haters.
Well, in
on
this
the other
case,
side
it's justifiable because I'll say this. And first of all, Kevin O'Neill, appreciate the super chat very, 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 very much, man. I really appreciate
And if you got a question to throw in,
part of our community.
If you missed that,
that's just a dude that loves the Irish Breakdown community and loves being part of it. So I appreciate that.
Thank you
very, very much. But so a lot of it is the laziness, but Bill Connolly's is a little different because he is very much a numbers-driven guy.
Sure.
And I don't think what he does is lazy. I just think he has an incredibly faulty formula that he has yet to change the way that it needs to change. I mean, this is the same guy that after the 2019 season was played out, his formula still said Ohio State and Clemson ranked ahead of LSU. Now,
the LSU team that broke all offensive
Clemson,
numbers. Yeah.
Well, not only that, but LSU smacked Clemson in the title game. Clemson beat Ohio State, and that LSU team beat 7 top 15 opponents that year. And yet his formula basically said that they were still somehow ranked below Clemson, Ohio State. It's like, at some point in time, when your formula keeps telling you dumb stuff,
you got to figure out the formula.
Wisconsin was ahead of Notre Dame last year. Penn State was 4 and 5. Penn State was 1 spot below Notre Dame last year. At some point in time, you got to be able to look at your
North
schedule.
Carolina was ahead of Notre Dame.
Right,
and Notre Dame smoked them. So
at
where
their
does that
place
come from? Yes, on the road
at their place.
But they're going to come in and beat Notre Dame at their place. Whatever.
So that's the thing is, we have been here before with Notre Dame, and one of the things that I don't think is happening, and this is where I think a big picture is. We're going to dive into some specifics here, but I think big picture, I still feel that there are things being held against Notre Dame that aren't being held against other programs, and we'll dive into it a little bit when we get into schedule. But I think that there aren't enough people evaluating recent history, and to me, 2017 on is how Notre Dame needs to be evaluated because they had such a complete changeover from a staff standpoint. I can't continue to say, well, I think Notre Dame's going to have a horrible run defense in 2021. Well, why do you think that? Well, because 2014 to 2016, they had the worst defense in school history. Well, hey, you do know the dude that ran that defense is gone, right? And none of the players on those teams are so. You get what I'm saying? So it's like what should carry more weight? What they've done in recent history, or what they did 7, 8, 9, 20 years ago. And that to me is that lazy aspect of it, Vince, is that's when you can tell someone's making a prediction based off their feelings as opposed to the just hard research data driven stuff. I mean, and that's my thing. And I'm not predicting, and I'm someone who right now is not necessarily predicting Notre Dame to make it to the college football playoff again. It's not so much that they should be once again a top 5 team. It's just that where they are is a little low to me, but more so, why are they being held to a different standard than North Carolina? I saw a poll, ESPN's poll has Notre Dame ranked 6 spots behind, wait for it, drum roll, USC.
Are people still living in 2005 with the USC? Like, I don't understand the love for USC. Are they going to have guys on their team? Yeah, they're going to have really good players on their team. I get that. Yeah. But so does Florida State.
They had really good players on their team in 2019 when Notre Dame beat them. They had really good players on their team in 2018 when Notre Dame beat them. They had Sam Darnold and a lot of great players on the 2017 Notre Dame team that curb stomped them.
Yes.
They had, they beat US. They haven't beat Notre Dame since 2016.
Right.
And then Notre Dame beat them again in 2015. So what, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, the last 5 years, Notre Dame's beat them 4 out of 5 times.
And I don't.
But
and,
yet they're going to be ranked ahead of them. North Carolina
are they giving the head coach props? Because what has he done? Like, I don't know. I would have to have somebody explain to me why USC is supposed to be so good, because my prediction for them is by the time they get to the Notre Dame game, that is no longer going to be a big game. Right. They'll have already, tripped over themselves enough times where, people will be backtracking very quickly, not only on USC, but probably the entire Pac-12.
Yeah. So, Vince, we're going to dive into some reasons, but before we do, this is a podcast, so this is meant to be like we're going to talk about some topics. We'll get to your questions after the show is over. If you want to if you have a question or you have a comment you want to get heard now, do a super chat. We'd appreciate that. But there was one comment that was too good not to put in right now, and that's from Jack. And it's nice to see you're finally working, Vince. Good to see you both together. Yes, it is nice to have Vince back on the show. He's finally put his priorities in the right place, and he's back where he belongs with his Irish Breakdown family.
Absolutely.
But, Vince, let's dive into the reasons why as we look at the what the different prognosticators write about their justifications for Notre Dame. The first one is obvious, and that is heavy personnel losses. Ian Book gets mentioned in every article that talks about it. Which, again, I understand. As much as Notre Dame pushed he's a winner, 30-5, 30-5. I get it, right?
Sure.
Now, we don't need to talk about the fact that Ohio State and Clemson lost quarterbacks that were far more effective and better and winning and all that stuff than Ian Book, and they're still ranked in the top 5, but we only talk about that.
Right.
The big one is the 4 offensive linemen and the fact that they lost.
Understand.
The perception is they've lost 9 starters on offense. That's what everybody says because they count Tommy Tremble and Brock Wright as starters. I mean, they don't count Michael Mayer as a returning starter. They don't count Avery Davis as a returning starter. And technically that's accurate. But that's it's the 4 starters along the offensive line and losing Ian Book. It's the heavy personnel losses is the first reason why.
That's the 5. And look, from a cursory look, you lose 4 offensive linemen, you're going to take a step back. Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm not even that upset about when they bring up the 4 offensive lineman thing because
it's by far the most valid concern.
100%.
And Notre Dame did not take a step back as a team in 2018 when they lost McGlinchey and Quentin Nelson, but their line took a big step back.
Sure.
There's no doubt about that.
Sure.
And that is, to me, that is the most legitimate concern that people should have about what could cause Notre Dame to drop 6, 7, 8, 9, maybe even 10 spots in the rankings this year compared to last year.
And you know what? Like you said, I think it's valid. But again, if you do your homework and you realize what the depth chart looks like on the offensive line, you understand what Blake Fisher, Rocco Spindler, like what those guys have been doing. Mm-hmm. If you understand what the recruiting has been like at the offensive line position. And on top of that, you understand what this offense is in theory about to look like moving into the fall, because we've documented a million times that the philosophy has clearly changed, at least up to this point, and we hope to continue to see that be the case. But that's going to take the pressure off of the offensive line. Now, it's still a concern. I mean, you and I, if we were to pick a position group that we're most concerned about right now on June 1st, for me, it's offensive line. That's the number one concern because they still need to figure out who the starters are, who's going to be where. I mean, there's a lot of question marks there. No question about it. But that's not – I'm sorry. Replacing 4 out of the 5 guys does not send Notre Dame to a 5-loss season or even a 3-loss season. And we'll get into more of that later. But that can't be the sole reason because then they add on the Ian Book factor, right?
But I do think that is the biggest factor into why I'm not losing my mind with someone that has Notre Dame 8-10.
Yeah, right. And 8-10 is fine.
Yeah.
I'm totally fine with that.
I still think it's too low, but I get that.
Sure.
I get that. Because the thinking there is, well, Notre Dame wasn't very good on offense last year, and now they lost their quarterback and 4 starting offensive linemen, their 2 best receivers, a 3rd-round draft pick at tight end. I mean, so it becomes somewhat understandable, but again, it's okay. Well, Alabama lost a 1st-round draft pick at quarterback. Alabama lost a 1st-round draft pick at running back. Alabama lost 2 1st-round draft picks at wide receiver, and Alabama also lost 3 starting offensive linemen along their offensive line.
But they're still ranked where?
Right. Number
Top
one.
5.
Now you say, well, okay, but
Yeah.
Alabama's earned that. Okay. If Alabama's ranking is where they have ranked in recent seasons, they've earned it. Well, Notre Dame has finished 5th in 2 of the last 3 years.
Right.
And their lowest ranking in the last 4 years is 11th. Okay. So then my thing, so you shouldn't rank them lower than 11th, right? I mean, that's kind of, I guess, where I come from, Vince, is if you're going to still rank those teams in the top 4 because of where they finished in recent seasons, then Notre Dame should be higher. Because you can't say in one breath, well, Alabama is remaining the same because they've earned it, and then jump up Cincinnati or jump up North Carolina or jump up USC who hasn't earned it. You have to have, and I guess ultimately, Vince, that's my biggest criticism, is there's a lack of inconsistency in how they apply certain data, right? So X team is being dropped because they lost number of players. Well, this team over here lost the same exact players. Yeah, but that team's earned this. Okay, well then why are you jumping up North Carolina who lost more production?
They haven't earned anything, really, on the national scale. I mean, it's a fun conversation.
They have a great quarterback coming back, right? Okay.
Sure.
I think that's debatable, but that's the perception. I don't necessarily agree that Sam Howell is a great quarterback. I think Sam Howell is an air raid quarterback.
Well, we're going to find out.
Always going to put up production.
A really good quarterback this year because he's got to break into a lot of new guys around him.
Right. Now, they've got good, but here's the thing is, people say, well, look, they got the Tennessee transfer, Ty Chandler. Okay, well, I'd rather have Kyron Williams and Chris Tyree than him. They lost their top 2 receivers, including a 3rd-round draft pick in De'Ami Brown. Or was he 3rd? I think he was a 3rd-round pick. They also lost Daz Newsome. Well, but they got Bo Corrales coming back. They've got these 2 upcoming freshmen. Yet we don't hear anybody talking about Kevin Austin or Avery Davis or Braden Lindsey or Lawrence Keys in that way. And nobody's talking about, Michael Mayer. I mean, look, with all due respect, if you look at North Carolina's weapons, I think, and compare them to Notre Dame's, I think the 3 best returning skill players, you could argue 4 of the top 5 best returning skill players between the 2 teams after quarterback are Notre Dame guys. Tyree, Kyron Williams, Michael Mayer, and I'd probably put Braden Lindsey with, as far as what he's proven, if he's healthy. And so I said, well, Bam, he's got to be healthy. Well, so does Bo Corrales, who's expected to be North Carolina's top returning receiver, who was hurt last year.
Right.
Well, that's the thing for me is USC being up there. There's just a lack of consistency in how certain data is applied. And I think that's probably my biggest complaint. Right. More so specifically to their wrong about where Notre Dame is placed. It's you're bringing up things that are knocks on Notre Dame that aren't necessarily accurate. And they seem to focus so much on the offense that they don't talk about the fact that Notre Dame has been a defensive-driven team for years, really. I mean, really going back to 2018, the last 3 years especially, Notre Dame was more of an offensive-driven team in 2017, no question about it. But 2018 to 2020, easily, this has been a team driven by the success of its defense.
Correct. No question. And so the lack of personnel on the offensive side is tough for me to swallow, although I understand it. So, that's where I will lend some credence to that argument to a degree. The defensive side, it's just too easy for these writers to be like, well, they lost Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, so the defense is going to fall apart completely.
Right. One guy.
And then they'll throw in and I know we're not trying to pick on the 7-5 prediction, but reading your article this morning and the quote that he had in there about 2 top-level corners, a top-level safety, an outside line.
They lost a star corner and a star safety.
Correct.
I did not know that Nick McLeod and Sean Crawford were stars.
Hard time with that. I mean, and look,
2 undrafted free agents, by the way.
I love those guys. They were important to Notre Dame. Okay. Yeah. They're not stars. They're not stars. Right. And they are replaceable. And it's okay to be replaceable. Right?
Every team has guys that are very good that can be replaceable. Yes. That's called reloading. That's not saying correct. Does anyone think Alabama's defense is going to suck this year because they lost Patrick Surtain?
Right.
No.
Exactly.
Now, does that mean that he wasn't good? Of course he was good, but they're in a position to reload it. I'll say this. The one thing that I've seen some people talk, and again, I don't want to focus too much on criticism of what Bill Connelly said because it is the outlier. What he wrote,
it
the
is.
7-5, is the outlier.
Yes.
We're talking more rational, reasonable stuff, which is the 8 to 15, the people, especially people 12 to 15.
And every one of those people that has ranked them brings up Jeremiah Usikormo leaving. And the defense is going to,
which is to me, it's a valid reason to say, okay, well, let's dive in to see what else they have. I think the other valid criticism that they have of the defense is the secondary was not great last year, and then you lose 2 starters. I think so.
Sure.
So there is some legitimacy to that concern. If I'm not legitimacy to in that I'm as concerned about secondary, but I can understand why an outsider that doesn't cover the team on a daily basis like we do
because
would view that because
you're talking about a bunch of guys without a lot of proven success.
Right.
And
the secondary wasn't great last year anyway.
Sure. Absolutely. I get that.
Right.
Totally.
Now,
and that,
the
like
thing
you said,
about it is your best player on defense plays in the secondary.
Correct.
But I don't expect them to know who Cam Hart is. I don't expect them to know who Clarence Lewis is. So I mean, I get it. But like, to me, I look at the secondary and I truly believe the secondary in 2021 is going to be better than it was in 2020.
Yeah.
But I can understand, this is where I say there's some legitimacy to some of these concerns. I can understand why an outsider would have a concern. So I'm not losing my mind about I think they're going to be proven to be inaccurate on the secondary.
Sure.
But I think it's a legitimate reason to have some question marks, especially when you consider a lot of people are going to view Jeremiah Wusu as being just as big of a loss for the secondary as he was the linebacking core when you consider how good he was in coverage.
I get that.
And so I think those are legitimate concerns. The one that I've heard levied. Go ahead, Vince.
But I was going to say, I bet I know a spot where you will lose your mind.
I did a lot of deep thinking on my drive home from Ohio yesterday. I've done some prayer so that I don't lose it.
All right. Well, I'm gonna tee you up here, and we're gonna see where it goes. But I have also read that there's not a lot of faith in the defensive line. Coming back this year because of the losses. 2 starting defensive ends left, obviously, and
who
the other
good players in 5th-round draft picks. I mean, those are legitimate.
Absolutely. Losses. If you're giving me the option to have those guys come back, I'm going to take them back, right? I mean, let's just be honest. But they did not do a very deep dive on the defensive line, and that is where I will hand it off to you, sir.
And this is where I think this is one of those criticisms, Vince, where I think we're still dealing with Notre Dame of past years.
Right.
One of the issues with Notre Dame of the past was Notre Dame just didn't have a lot of depth along the defensive line. That was a valid criticism of the Notre Dame program.
Absolutely.
And years where they would lose starters, there was always a big drop-off defensively. So you look at, after 2013, when you lost Stephon Tuitt, you lost Lewis Nix. The front 7 took a big step back.
Right.
You look at 2015, after they lost Sheldon Day and Romeo Okwara and from that team. Big step back in 2016, even though they had some NFL players on it with Jerry Tillery and Isaac Rochelle. Big step back. So I understand the criticism of that if we're looking at it from a historical picture of the last 15, 20 years.
Look at you. You did do
but
some
I
yoga
don't think it shows a lot of – how do I say this? It doesn't show a lot of knowledge of the current Notre Dame situation.
Research, whatever.
Because we've seen Notre Dame lose big-time defensive linemen in recent seasons. And not only be good, but actually be better in following seasons. I mean, you lost Jerry Tillery and John Bonner, both your starting defensive tackles after the 2018 season. Your 2019 defense is pretty good. You lose Julian Okwara and Khalid Kareem from last year's defensive line, 3rd and a 5th-round draft picks. They were drafted even higher. And then Jameer Jones steps in because you had lost Dalen Hayes and Julian Okwara. Jameer Jones steps in, and his production was equal to that of those 2 players when he was playing. You lost him as well. You also, as I mentioned last year, lost Osmar Bilal, who was your best line. You're one of your best defensive players and your second best linebacker, a guy that had 10+ tackles for loss. And you lost 3 starters from your secondary who were all in the NFL last year. 2 of them were drafted. Jalen Elliott was with the Lions all year. Plus, you lost another guy who started half your games last year in the secondary, and Dante Vaughn, who also is on an NFL roster right now. And yet their defense was every bit as good as it was the year before, if not a little bit better. And so to me, the fact that there are people dinging the defensive line shows me that that's where I say you haven't done your homework.
Right, and it
That
wouldn't even
shows me
take
that
a
if
lot of homework
I have
to me.
Yeah, like I'm reading
sorry.
Athlon right now, right, Vince? And Athlon had
Yeah.
Notre Dame 12th, and I always enjoy Athlon, but they had some pretty screwy things in their thing this year. Not as bad as Pro Football Focus not having Kyron Williams or Michael Mayer in their top 10. But I'm reading through their analysis here, and I don't see one mention so far of Jason Adamiola. Right? Well, okay, that's somewhat understandable because he hasn't been a starter and his numbers don't jump out at you at all. But if you watched the last two games, so I'm just watch the last two games and do any kind of research and grades or just with your eyes, Notre Dame's best defensive lineman in the last two games was in fact Jason Adamiola.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at it here and it's talking about the defensive line, and I don't see any mention of Isaiah Foskey. and so I look at it and I'm like, it doesn't make a lot. It just shows that, hey, you're relying on your feelings based on history, and you're not relying on what the film shows.
Right.
And you haven't asked hey, Clemson, who was the guy that gave you the hardest time in the ACC title game? Hey, Alabama's coaches, who's the guy that for Notre Dame that gave you the hardest time in the playoff game? Guarantee they would have said Jason Adamiola because he was killing their offensive line in that game. And there were plays where he was making plays, but the other guys weren't stepping up to help out, and so you'd still see Alabama have some success. And so if you're not talking about Foskey and Adamiola and the fact that Myron Tungvaloa and Kurt Hinish were so good last year in their roles, especially Kurt Hinish, and who was an all-ACC performer. Myron Tungvaloa was a second-team all-ACC performer. It just shows me that you haven't really done your homework.
Exactly.
Because I'm sitting there thinking that, okay, these teams these analysts are going to make, they're going to know what they're talking about. And I look at Athlon's top 10 position rankings, and, I wasn't shocked that I didn't see Notre Dame in the top 10, but I have to say I was surprised to see Notre Dame not in there, but to see some of the teams that were in there there.
Exactly.
It's like Oklahoma at 6, Cincinnati at 7. Does anyone think that Marcus Freeman would trade the Cincinnati defensive line, even as good as Myjai Sanders was, for what he has at Notre Dame? LSU, based on what? Their defense was awful last year.
Terrible.
TCU, so that's kind of my thing is if you're not looking at this Notre Dame defensive line and recognizing that this has a chance to be one of the 10, 12 best units in the country at their position.
Right.
And I don't know what we're not speaking the same language anymore.
No, not at all.
I'm talking reality. You're still talking, back in 19 whatever. This is the case. That's the one that to me, like I'm fine with people not like if someone's going to tell me, hey, I'm real concerned about Notre Dame's linebacking core. Okay, I get it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not, but I get why you would be. Because your job isn't to cover the team every day like mine is.
Right.
I don't expect you to have the knowledge of Notre Dame that I do.
Exactly.
But you can't be that off.
But you know what?
That's my thing. You can't be that off.
I don't know. Maybe ego gets in the way, but like, how about you shoot one of the guys on the beat an email or, hey, what's the team?
Well, then you got to be careful which person on the beat you hit up.
Fair.
You're
right.
Notre Dame's going to go 5-7 this year, depending on who you talk to.
Yeah, that's fair. But I just feel like it's, and I hate to use the word lazy because you're talking about somebody's profession, but it is a little bit lazy. It just is. You're clearly not watching film. You're clearly not reaching out to anybody and asking any kind of questions. You know what I mean? Like it's just it's not that hard.
Starts to sink in too, Vince.
Yeah,
that's why I think Iowa State can get so much love. I think there's some groupthink involved in that. I think the other thing that is a mistake that people are making, and this is just a general mistake. This isn't necessarily specific to Notre Dame. There's too many analysts putting too much emphasis on last year's results, and the reason I say that is because
last year was weird.
Yeah, you have teams that never played a single team out of their league,
right? Exactly.
And that's something that has to be focused on. Is there was too many teams, in my opinion, that you say, well, you're making this opinion because hey, well, they really struggle with this, and this, and it's like I don't know if you say, okay, well, and then you look at Iowa State, for example. They had a nice win over Oregon in a bowl game. It was a beaten down Oregon team that played 4 or 5 games last year, right? Had most of their best players were sitting out last year.
Yeah, right. Sure.
That was also the same team that lost 31-14 to Louisiana. And so it's like, well, what has Iowa State done to be getting this benefit of the doubt? Well, they have a lot of experience coming back. Well, okay, but this is college football. Teams lose players all the time. And does anyone think that Matt Campbell, I mean, if Matt Campbell were to be asked, he might say this because, you're loyal to your players. But is there anyone that would say, I'd trade Notre Dame's roster for Iowa State's roster right now? I don't know many people that would rashly say that.
No.
And so that's my thing is, what evidence do you have that North Carolina is going to be a better football team than Notre Dame this year? What have they done because you say their biggest claim to fame was 2 years ago during a 7-6 season, they almost beat Clemson.
Right.
Well, Notre Dame beat Clemson.
Right.
So it's like Notre Dame beat North Carolina at their place by multiple touchdowns in a game that wasn't competitive in the second half.
Right.
North Carolina did not threaten Notre Dame at all in the second half.
Right, exactly.
Without Kyle Hamilton. So to me, that's the thing is Notre Dame's defense, and this is the bigger picture, Vince. Notre Dame's defense is not getting the respect it deserves.
Absolutely.
From the national media. That ultimately is where I think this boils down to, that where they're missing. Is they're missing the fact that Notre Dame has been driven by its defense in recent years. And I think because Brian Kelly's considered an offensive coach, and let's be honest, a lot of their high draft picks have been offensive guys, which speaks volumes about the fact that Notre Dame's offense hasn't been better. When you consider how many of their high draft picks have been actually offensive players. Their first 2 draft picks this year were offensive players. 4 of their first 5 draft picks this year were offensive players. 2017 team, you had 2 top 10 draft picks from the only guys that got drafted off that 2017 team that year were offensive guys. Mm-hmm. And last year, Chase Claypool, Cole Kmet. Yet it's been the defense that's driven this whole thing. And that's where I think a lot of these analysts are missing the boat is Notre Dame's defense has played championship football in the last 3 years, and I would argue in all but 1.5 games. I think there was a stretch for about a quarter and a half against Alabama where they weren't playing their game. And then there was about a quarter, the second quarter against Clemson in the title game, they didn't play their game. And then the Michigan game in 2019. That's it. The defense played well enough to beat Georgia twice.
Yeah.
The defense played well enough to hang with Clemson in the Rose Bowl in 2018. The defense has played good enough to beat Clemson this year. They made some really big plays in that game to win the game. So that's really, to me, the biggest mistake that they're making is there's just not enough people that recognize how good this defense has been. And then you're going to praise how good Cincinnati is on defense, but not spend enough time focusing on the fact that the architect of that defense is now in Notre Dame.
Well, okay, you set me up for this one because I was going to say you're talking about lack of respect. I think there's a lack of respect for Marcus Freeman from national writers, not from the coaching world, because I think in the coaching world he's a superstar. But I think national writer-wise, people don't understand what Marcus Freeman did for that Cincinnati defense, and they're ranking Cincinnati so high.
Right.
And part of that is because of the defense.
The main part of it.
The defensive coordinator's gone.
I'm going to somewhat disagree with you, Vince, because when you listen to them write about Marcus Freeman, they praise him. I mean, just great coach and did all this.
They're disrespectful,
but then it doesn't
rankings,
reflect in their analysis of what the defense is going to look like.
Yes,
it's like they praise that Clark Lee did a great job, and Marcus Freeman's going to do a great job. Yet the defense is not going to be great.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just like, and it's just another reflection on. I just think that they're still living in the past when Notre Dame didn't have NFL talent on defense.
Yes.
That's what it boils down to. I mean, Notre Dame this year, in my opinion, has arguably, because there's, Kayvon Thibodeau could have a say in this. There's some defensive players who are right. Arguably the best defensive player in the country coming back next year. Right?
Yep.
In Kyle Hamilton. They've got 2 3-year starters on the defensive line coming back. They've got a 3-year starter at linebacker coming back who has to fight to keep his job. Right? Or at least to maintain the reps. And then you have the up-and-coming players. So to me, again, that's what it boils down to, is there is a lack of recognition that this isn't your Notre Dame of pre-2017.
Right.
That's the mistake that I think that they make. And it's like when people talk to me, well, Notre Dame doesn't show, look what happened when they played Alabama in 2012. Hey, man, that game doesn't matter anymore. Like, there's 2 coaches left from that staff at Alabama, and there's 2 coaches left from that staff at Notre Dame, and none of the players the players from those teams are long gone, right? Let's talk about what's recent history, and I think that ultimately is really where it comes down to when lack respect for Notre Dame. There's another part to this too, Vince, and I think that is this schedule is going to be tougher.
Yeah, I wanted to jump into that.
It will
too.
be. It has to be. I mean, last year's schedule was pretty soft.
The ACC schedule last year was not good. But again, you have to be thankful that Notre Dame had a schedule at all. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it is what it is.
Well, it just wasn't a great year in the ACC period.
Right.
Louisville was way down.
Sure.
They didn't play Miami. Florida State's down. Virginia Tech's down. I mean, it wasn't a good year for the ACC in general.
But with that being said, the schedule this year is not exactly murderer's row either.
No.
Okay. And people need to understand that. Florida State is not the Florida State of Bobby Bowden in the early 90s. Okay.
They're not the Florida State of 4 years ago.
Fair enough. They're just not. Okay. And is that going to be a fun opener on Labor Day weekend? And it's going to be the only game on Sunday, right? And it's going to be a lot of, yeah, it is. Mm-hmm. I expect Notre Dame to dominate that game. I really do.
Should.
And we mentioned it before. The 4 quote unquote big games that Notre Dame is going to have are either at home or at a neutral site, which is in Chicago, which is essentially a home game for Notre Dame. They have literally had a home game at Soldier Field in the past against Miami, and it was a home game, and they dominated Miami, right? So I just all the people saying how difficult this schedule is going to be, and how Cincinnati, Wisconsin's a favorite. They're a 4-point favorite over Notre Dame in Chicago. I need to get on my betting app and put a bet on that game right now, getting 4 points from Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And I will put my mortgage on that. Okay.
Yeah.
Barring some crazy injuries going into it. I'm not afraid of USC. Am I afraid of USC's athletes? Sure. They're going to have athletes. They're in Southern California. They should. Okay. But they also had a mass exodus of players in the offseason because it's chaos in Southern California. Okay.
And I also don't understand where this Wisconsin love is coming from. I don't get it. And here's where there's a lot of hypocrisy on it. Number one is Wisconsin went 4-3 last year. They beat Illinois, who stunk. They beat Michigan, who stunk.
Right.
They beat Minnesota, who I believe had a losing record last year.
They had a lot of hype going in, I think.
Yes. Yeah, Minnesota went 3-4 last year. Wisconsin beat them by 3 at home. And then they beat Wake Forest in a bowl game. Wake Forest stunk last year. Wake Forest went 4-5 last year.
Right.
They scored a combined 20 points on offense in losses to Northwestern, Indiana, and Iowa. Scored a combined 20 points. Matter of fact, here's a better way to look at it. They gave up 17 points to Northwestern, 14 points to Indiana, and 28 points to Iowa, and lost all 3 games.
Yeah. I'm not impressed with
the
their
guy
offense
that led. They said, well, in 2019 they were really good. Okay, well, their quarterback now plays for Notre Dame. Well, yeah, but they had Jonathan Taylor. Who's he play for now?
Right. He doesn't play for Wisconsin anymore.
Right.
He plays for the Colts.
So it's just like, what are you basing this Wisconsin love on? Again, it goes back to it's the past. It's not looking at what they're doing now. It's the past. And that's the thing. But Jim Leonard's a great coordinator. He has a lot of players coming back on defense. Yeah, so does Notre Dame.
Yeah. Right. And here's the thing. I would take I'll say new vamped Notre Dame offense. Yeah. Okay. The new philosophical, Notre Dame offense. They're going to almost accidentally score more than 21 points. Okay.
Well, the best response I get from that, Vince, is, well, if Jack Cohn was that good, he'd still be at Wisconsin. Because coaches don't make mistakes, right? Because clearly Mike Glennon was better than Russell Wilson.
Right.
Let's not forget why Russell Wilson left NC State. It's because they wanted to play Mike Glennon. So what did Russell Wilson do? He went to Wisconsin and had a phenomenal season. So that's the other one. It's like, well, if Jack Cohn's so good, he'd still be at Wisconsin. Okay, whatever. All I know is this. Jack Cohn was Wisconsin's quarterback. He led him to the Rose Bowl in a Big Ten title game, and they beat a top 10 Minnesota team by 21 at Minnesota. Okay, so I'll take that guy over what we saw from that team.
And look, the weapons around Jack Cohn are better than the weapons around Graham Mertz.
Pass game wise, yes.
Pass game wise,
yeah.
Not offensive line yet. I might have a different thought going into that game after we've seen
running backs in Notre Dame are better. They're not better than they were in 2019. With all due respect to Kyron Williams, he ain't Jonathan Taylor.
No.
Neither is any other running back in college football this year.
Exactly. You got
to
give credit where credit's due, okay? That kid was awesome. And it made Jack Cohn's life a lot easier, too, because you could hand off to that young man. But, again, Notre Dame has North Carolina at home. Again, I don't see where all the hype is around North Carolina. Okay, and we talked about that. We don't need to rehash it. And then one article, I believe Virginia Tech was supposed to be a big game for Notre Dame.
Yeah,
and isn't Notre Dame not favored in that game according to his formula?
The Bill Connolly one, no, it is. There's basically a 50-50 chance that Notre Dame beats Virginia Tech. There is a less than 50-50 chance that Notre Dame beats North Carolina, Cincinnati, USC, and almost no chance that they beat Wisconsin.
Ridiculous. Okay. So again, the schedule shapes up nicely for Notre Dame. I do like how it sets up for them as far as who they get when. I do like it. And the big games are the home games. And so I like that as well. And I just feel like there is a mantra at Notre Dame about protecting the home field. And whether you want to, whether the Ian Book people want to give that to Ian Book, or whether you want to give it to Brian Kelly, or you want to give it to the program, whatever you want to do, I don't care.
I mean, Ian Book's had some pretty big moments
absolutely.
In Virginia Tech in 2019 and Clemson
whatever it
last
is,
year and all that. Right.
It's a culture now at Notre Dame. Protecting the home field is now a culture at Notre Dame, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. I don't.
Well, what kills me, Vince, is in order to think that Notre Dame is going to lose 3 games in the regular season, which to have them lower than 10th, you have to think they're going to lose more than 2 games.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think having them 8th, like Yahoo Sports, 10-2. 8th is like a 10-2 record.
Sure.
Right? Okay, I can see that one. Maybe you lose lose either Wisconsin or
and I'm cherry picking a question here because we're talking about it. Jack says, honestly, you guys have said 10 or 2 or 11-2, 2 losses. What 2 losses do you see? I've looked at the schedule over and over, and I just don't see it. Go ahead.
It's not about going undefeated in college football. I've talked about this. It's hard to do
for sure.
Alabama has lost many regular season games to teams that weren't as good as them. They lost twice to Ole Miss.
Right.
They lost to Auburn multiple times. There's been plenty of teams that Notre Dame has lost to, or that Alabama has lost to. Syracuse in 2017 lost to a 4-8 Syracuse team. In 2016, the year that Clemson won the national title, they lost in the second to last game of the regular season to a 8-5 Pitt team. So there's going to be games where you're going to stub your toe. Now, Notre Dame hasn't had that in recent seasons. But it's going to happen, and I don't expect Notre Dame to run the table. I mean, I don't think Alabama has maybe once under Nick Saban has had back-to-back undefeated regular seasons.
Sure,
I don't anticipate Notre Dame going undefeated. But the point is, there's enough good teams. See, here's the difference between me and some of these analysts. Between Wisconsin, North Carolina, USC, Cincinnati, and I'd even throw Stanford in there. And then you have some of those second-level games against an ascending Georgia Tech, a tough UVA and Virginia Tech on the road. There's some games where a Notre Dame team could stub their toe once or twice. It could happen.
Yeah, right.
There's also a game where, if Notre Dame's down a couple players, this team's going to be a little harder to beat than maybe some of these other things. And so that's what I'm saying. If you got Notre Dame 5th to 8th, I can mess with you. We can have a conversation. Maybe I'd have them 11-1, but I can mess with you. Here's my problem. Here's my problem with the Vince. Notre Dame has not lost a regular season game. So in the 4-year stretch that we're talking about, right? Notre Dame has lost 1 game at home. That was their second home game during the stretch to Georgia by a point. to a Georgia team that went on to be the national runners-up, took Alabama to overtime in the national title game. Okay? Since that time, they haven't lost a home game. There haven't actually been that many competitive home games, if we're being honest. There really haven't. And when you look at it, you have to say, okay, they're now only not only going to lose that game at home, but they're going to lose multiple games at home this year. Bill Connolly's predicting that Notre Dame is going to lose 3 home games this year.
Yes, correct.
3 home games to a team not named Clemson, Alabama, Georgia, or Oklahoma, or Ohio State.
Right.
3 home games. He's got them losing to Cincinnati, USC, and North Carolina. Right. Now, USC hasn't beat Notre Dame at home since what? 2011? An 11-win USC team came to Notre Dame the year after Notre Dame went 4-8, and Notre Dame curb stomped them.
Yep.
With Sam Darnold at quarterback.
That was a fun game. That's where I lost all respect for Sam Darnold, but that's another story.
Sam Darnold was not the reason that they lost that game.
I understand that.
But so my point is, Vince, is and I know you got to run here, so I want to let you get your thoughts in on the schedule. Yeah. But when I look at that, that's the thing that I find most absurd is to have Notre Dame losing 3 games. You have to either predict that they're going to lose to Wisconsin and Virginia Tech, and I don't see how anyone in the world could project. Now, could Virginia Tech beat Notre Dame? Yes, they could beat Notre Dame. Of
course.
Should anyone on this planet that's not associated with Virginia Tech think or predict that they're going to lose to them? No, not if you're basing it off the last 4 years.
Right.
The only way you can predict Notre Dame to lose, because look, Notre Dame went to Virginia Tech in 2018
and won
and beat the crap out of them.
It was a great pregame and all, but it didn't last.
Which is, by the way, being there is very overrated.
Really?
Sandman thing, very overrated.
Okay. All right, cool. I will, just to respond to the question about how kind of we're predicting 2 losses or whatever. Yes, I'm predicting maybe 1 or 2 losses because of everything that Brian just said. The problem for me is I agree that I'm looking at the schedule and I'm not picking out specifically what losses those are going to be. It's not like next year where they play Ohio State, they play Clemson. I'm like, okay, those are probably losses, right? If I was going to say that, like picking out the specific game that they're going to lose. And if I'm going over Notre Dame's track record, saying they're going to lose 2 games and knowing what they've done at home against quality opponents, right? They're undefeated at home against quality opponents in there.
A streak that will eventually end.
Of course it will.
And it's not going to end 2 or 3 times in one season.
And that's the thing. All their tough games are at home, okay? And if you want to call Wisconsin a tough game, that's fine. But I almost look at that as like a 1B home game, okay? Because you're going to Chicago. That's pretty much Notre Dame Central, okay? So I just have a really hard time.
Does anyone think that's going to be a pro-Wisconsin crowd?
Not a chance. And it's their home game because it's on Fox.
Look, the only chance, in my opinion, could Wisconsin beat Notre Dame? Sure.
Of course. Yeah, sure.
Okay. The only hope that Wisconsin had to beat Notre Dame, in my opinion, is to play at Camp Randall.
Yes.
I mean, there's no part of their roster that you'd say, yeah, I'd trade that for Notre Dame's.
I agree.
There's not one.
I agree. And
not
that includes one. The quarterback that used to wear that helmet.
Right.
Like, I can't pick out specifically what game it's going to be that they would lose. It'll
most likely not be one of the games people think. It'll be something like
exactly
Virginia Tech, or a game where there's some injuries or something like that. I mean, that's what it's going to be. And I think the final piece of this, Vince, and I want to say this before you have to go.
Okay.
I think the other thing that I see written a lot about Notre Dame and why they're being dropped is people say, well, look at how they played against Clemson and Alabama. Yeah. And I think that to me is hogwash. That's nonsense.
That's lazy.
It's lazy because, number one, all those games happen in the postseason, right? If you go back and look at how Notre Dame has played in those big games in the regular season, very, very, very rarely are those games bad. The Miami game in 2017 was bad, right? Michigan game last year was bad. But Georgia, Notre Dame had the ball late in the fourth quarter with a chance to win both games.
On the other 50-yard line.
They've played Clemson twice in the regular season. They lost by 2 points in a game where Notre Dame had a chance to tie on the final play of the game. And the other one, Notre Dame won.
Right.
They played Oklahoma twice in the last decade. Beat them once, lost to them another time. Right, in a game where Notre Dame had the ball in the fourth quarter with a chance to tie the game. Or actually, no, take a lead, and then it was to tie. It was 28-21. Notre Dame had the ball, and they turned it over, and Oklahoma went down and scored. So that's the thing to me is we're talking regular season here.
Right.
you can't tell me, well, Notre Dame doesn't play well in big games, because in recent years they have played well, at least to the point where the teams that have beat them have been national title contenders.
Right.
Who's the Georgia on this schedule?
Right. Exactly.
Who's the Clemson on this schedule?
Exactly.
It ain't Wisconsin. That's for darn sure.
Yep.
And until North Carolina proves something, it's not them either. So I know you got to bounce, Vince, but I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that last.
No,
part.
I agree completely. And the schedule, I think, shapes up very nicely for Notre Dame. And again, I don't have the stones to predict an undefeated season yet, because it's very difficult to go undefeated. I'm not willing to go there yet, because these are still college age kids who, can lose focus, or a million different things can happen where you lose a game. So I'm not ready to say undefeated season. I think that's maybe a little bit too homerish. But if you take each game in a bubble, in a vacuum, I think Notre Dame should be favored in every one of them.
10-2 is the absolute floor.
Yes.
For Notre Dame. Anything worse than that it's time to be critical of the job that the staff did.
Yeah, completely agree.
In my opinion.
Completely agree. And there's some let me get to one more question, just because there was one earlier that was directed right at me.
From
baseball.
Tommy's. Yeah, here I got it. I got that one right here. Yep, you got it? Okay.
Yep. It says, off topic, I'm wondering your thoughts, since you're a baseball coach. What's your opinion on unwritten rules of baseball, such as swinging a 3-0 pitch when up by a large number of runs? Number one, I believe it's different for professional athletes and high school athletes. If the situation was a team that I'm coaching at the high school level, I'm telling that kid to take all the way. Which apparently his coach did tell him to do.
That's
Tony
my issue with it.
Did give him the take sign, and that is my issue, is that he wasn't listening to his coach.
Right.
For professional baseball, I'm not giving him the take sign. You're paid to hit the ball. Go for it. If they want to put a position player
professional
on
baseball,
there,
we've seen teams come back from stupid.
Sure.
I mean, but if it's like 20 or 15-0, I mean, my big thing is, look, I don't watch much baseball anymore, to be completely honest with you, Vince. Professional baseball, I don't like the game as much ever since it became walk, strikeout, home run. I just don't enjoy baseball, the shifts and all that. I don't enjoy all that.
Yeah, I get.
Having said that, to me, I like that there's guys coming up that are emotional. That's why I love Ken Griffey Jr. so much. He wore his hat on backwards. He had swagger.
Dude.
If you don't want me to talk trash to you about hitting a home run, then don't give up a home run.
Stop me.
If you don't want me to glare you down when I strike you out, then don't freaking strike out. To me, this is I told my wife this the other day. I said the most like, I don't know, like, I don't want to say masculine, because I don't know if that's the word for it, but like the thing that I ever did in sports was throwing touchdown passes, playing defense, playing shortstop, hitting the baseball. And the most pride building thing I ever did was when I struck somebody out. Never did I feel more like I'm better than you. Right. Because it's me versus you. That's it. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that is a thing where you're like, if you don't have some swagger after that, then it's just kind of like, and so I like the new edge of baseball. And I don't watch it a lot, but when I see the clips on Twitter and stuff, it doesn't bother me for Fernando Tatis, stares people down. I think there's a line that you can cross. I haven't seen him cross it yet.
Sure.
I don't mind bat flips. I mean, you ever hit a ball 450 feet? The next time you hit a ball 450 feet, you tell me if you have no emotion afterwards.
Right, exactly.
Then do it in front of 30,000 people, right?
And I have no problem.
Those unwritten rules, I don't. In 3-0, look, if you're not given a sign and you want to swing at 3-0, okay, and it's a big lead, go for it. I don't care.
Yeah.
My only issue with that specific situation is you were given a take sign and you disobeyed it because of your own ego.
That's my big issue. That's my big issue as well. And, again, from the high school level, when we have mercy rules at our level, right? So like 10 runs after 5, the game is over. And I've been on both sides of that. I have won by that much and I have lost by that much. Yeah. Okay. All in the last season. And so once I get up by 10, I'm station to station,
because those are kids too. They're not 100% professional athletes.
100%.
I agree with you completely.
Huge difference, right? We want the win. We're going to get the win, but we're going to do it the right way, that kind of thing. But as far as, that specific situation, I have a problem with him not listening to his coach. But if I was his coach, I would not have given him that signal. I would have said, if it's there, go for it.
Should LaRussa have given him the 3-0 signal?
Right.
But if he gave it to you,
then that's what it is.
You take it.
Then LaRussa be a man and bench your guy for not following.
I'm also not a big fan of, what am I supposed to do? Just let him walk the bases loaded and then we pile it up. I mean, so
right.
I think a lot of the unwritten rules in baseball are ridiculous. I don't have a problem with that unwritten rule being broken. I only have an issue if you don't listen to your coach.
And the other unwritten rule I have a problem with in that particular situation was the manager not sticking up for his guy 2 days later or whatever when they threw at him, and they're like, yeah, throw at him.
Yeah.
What?
That's your ego now getting in the way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You can tell your guy behind closed doors whatever you want, but out in public,
I can be as pissed as it's like a family. Look, I will talk trash to my sister. I'll say something to my sister, my dad or whatever, but nobody else better do that, right? Like I'll tell you, Vince, I'll trash talking you when we're joking around, but anybody else does it, we have some problems.
We're going to go. Absolutely.
And that was my big issue with Tony La Russa. And I think Tony La Russa is a great manager. Obviously, he's a Hall of Famer, but
I think he was a great manager.
I don't care how pissed you are that he ignored your signal. If you're that pissed, then you bench him.
Yeah. And you tell him about it behind closed doors.
Right.
You back him up when you're in the media.
Yeah. Hey, he handled that incredibly poorly.
Yeah, no question.
You don't do that.
Thanks for the question, Tommy. I love talking about that kind of stuff. So I'm going to bug out. I've got class here in about 2 minutes, but thankfully it's the last day of school.
We'll see you back on the show tomorrow, Vince.
All right, man.
1 o'clock. We're going to talk some recruiting tomorrow. We're going to talk about gap closers tomorrow during the show. Ryan Bonk says we're going to go through some questions and comments here quickly. ESPN Plus writer had Notre Dame going 7-5 this year. What a joke! It absolutely was a joke. Omar says ESPN have lost their minds. That happened a while ago. There's no question. Kevin Thomas says, hold on, see. All right. Kevin Thomas says it's the issue with saying Notre Dame is what Brian Kelly's finally developed versus what it was a decade or so ago. Completely agree with you, Kevin. I think you nailed it. Also, you probably get more clicks, more comments from Notre Dame fans when you do that. And that was Vince's point too. This isn't just about honest, objective analysis of Notre Dame. This is also about them trying to do things to generate social media clicks, which equals money. In this day of where advertising drives much of what you get paid. And look, that's how it works for me. I mean, I could go put a clickbait article out there and it could get a ton of views. If I wrote an article tomorrow saying that Notre Dame should fire Brian Kelly, I'd probably get a month's worth of income from that. But it would be a stupid article that I don't believe. Just that's an issue I have is there's too much stuff that's being put out for the consumption of the consumer as opposed to providing the consumer with legitimate hard work and analysis, and that's my problem. Notre Dame 2164, Jeremiah Usu-Cormo is unbelievable, but it takes more than a single linebacker to make a team. Agree completely. D-Rock says, defund ESPN. Good afternoon, everyone, and go Irish. Fans have the ability to do that, and that is just stop watching. But it's very, very hard to do, obviously. All right. And as Blake said, we put this up earlier, make sure that you hit the like button before you leave. Hit the subscribe button to our show. And, of course, hit the notification bell so you get all of our shows. All right. Josh Colossus says, has season started yet? Because I sure as heck am ready for it to get going. I agree. And when articles come out like this, it only makes me more fired up for the season to start. Notre Dame 2164. I have Notre Dame reloading this year, not rebuilding. I think they have earned that. I agree. There's no excuse for Notre Dame to take a step back. And when I say take a step back, I don't mean if they don't go undefeated, it's a step back. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about just, being that team that, me being with a loss, you're going into November with a chance to play for the college football playoff, and you're going to finish strong. If they go 10-2, I don't view that as a step back. If they go, if they're not in the playoff again, that's not necessarily a step back. I don't expect them to do that every single year. It's to still be that caliber of team, however. That's where I get an issue. Coleman Smith says, I say we should start 10 because based off last year, we were a top 4 team, but we are coming off a loss. I don't think the coming off a loss thing that matters to me. Notre Dame entered the college football playoff, I believe, as a 3 seed. They got beat by 2 higher ranked teams. I don't think that means they should then drop behind other teams who didn't play or beat those teams that are ranked ahead of them. So I get what you're saying, Coleman. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think the ranking should be based off what you have coming back relative to what you have done in recent seasons. And to me, none of that data tells me that Notre Dame should be ranked behind Iowa State. That doesn't tell me that Notre Dame should be ranked behind North Carolina or Cincinnati or USC. That's where I have the question mark. And then Coleman also says, what is a realistic expectation for Jack Cohn coming from Wisconsin and not playing last year? I'm not concerned about him not playing last year as much. I think a realistic expectation is that, obviously, number one, you stay healthy. Number two, he needs to do what he did at Wisconsin, which is run the offense, get the ball where it needs to get to, let the playmakers go out there and make the plays and just make good decisions. The quarterback at Notre Dame this year does not have to be Trevor Lawrence. He does not have to be Kyler Murray. He just needs to execute the offense and get the ball where it needs to get to. DJ Wilson, everybody hit the like button, please. Absolutely. Lucas Chapman says, my question is, if Notre Dame is ranked 10th, how many teams ahead of them will have a better O-line than them, even with their departures? That's a great question, Lucas. And again, is Notre Dame going to have a line as good as last year? Nope. Should their line still be top 10 to 12? Absolutely. That's where we're going to find out what kind of coach Jeff Quinn is. Because, yes, I think they will have a step back on offense or offensive line. But it shouldn't be the dramatic drop-off that we're talking about. Look, Oklahoma in 2018 went to the college football playoff. After that year, they lost Kyler Murray, and they lost 4 starting offensive linemen. And I'm going to look this up here real quick while I'm talking, because I believe all 4 of those offensive linemen got drafted. At least 3 of them did. But that team the next year, they saw a little bit of a drop-off in scoring. They went from like 48 to 42, but they still averaged only 7 fewer yards rushing that year. And they were still an outstanding football team. And I'm looking at it now. So Cody Ford was drafted in the 2nd round. Bobby Evans was in the 3rd round. Drew Samia was in the 4th round. And Bo Powers was in the 4th round. So 4 starting offensive linemen all drafted in the first 4 rounds. And Oklahoma still went out that next year, went to the playoff again, still averaged over 40 points a game, still averaged 240 rushing yards per game, and had a grad transfer quarterback and went out there the next year and made the college football playoff. There's no reason Notre Dame shouldn't still be really good on the offensive line, even if they're not elite like they were last year. I believe most of the sites just take the 2020 results plus minus starters lost plus recruiting ranking, no real research. DJ, I think that last part of it that you mentioned that we did not talk about during the show is another big part of it. I think there's way too much emphasis being put on recruiting rankings with some of these programs. Way too much emphasis on it. Like Georgia, for example, I mean, I don't know if Georgia has a better team than Notre Dame. Georgia hasn't necessarily had a better team than Notre Dame the last 3 years. The only Georgia team was clearly better than Notre Dame was the 2017 team, and that was clearly they won by a point in the head-to-head, but they were a better team by the end of the year. But Notre Dame's definitely had a better team than Georgia 2 last 3 years. But what does Georgia do? They recruit really well, and they're in the SEC. So I think that hype comes along with it too. Notre Dame 2164. Do you guys think Notre Dame will have to win a natty before everyone will give them the respect that I believe they've earned the past 4 years? I don't think they have to win a natty. I think what they have to do is they have to perform better in those big games. I mean, that is the one criticism that I have of Notre Dame, but I don't think that means instead of being 5th, they should be 10th. I still think they should be in that 5 to 7 range, in my opinion, 5 to 8 range. But to kind of start getting the benefit of the doubt, it's going to require you to win those games. It's going to require you to win a playoff game. And then, so like, let's say Notre Dame makes it the playoff this year, and they play Ohio State in the semifinals. They beat Ohio State and then go lose to Clemson in the title game by a touchdown in a competitive game. I think that's going to give them a ton of respect, even short of a national championship. Obviously, if they win a title, that changes things. But I don't think that's needed. I think that it's just win a big game, win a big bowl game. And then when you do lose competitively, because they changed that stigma a little bit with the win over Clemson in the regular season. But then when Clemson smacks you in the rematch, and then you get smacked by Alabama, a lot of that good vibes that you had after the Clemson win is now gone. Kevin Thomas says, I'm honestly okay being rated lower, gives you a chip. You obviously shouldn't need it, but that fire does help. I agree with that. Kevin Thomas responded to Notre Dame 2164. So I honestly don't think we need a natty for that. We still have top 2016 relatively recently in the rear view, and the pre-BK era where we were hyped up and did nothing, just a few more years of top 5. But see, I agree that is the thinking that goes into it. Where I would say my disagreement is, Kevin, and I don't think that you're making this point, but I don't think that should be the standard. What happened in 2016 and before is irrelevant, especially at Notre Dame, where there's 2 coaches on the coaching staff that were here then. Elston and Kelly are it, right? None of those coaches are gone. There's no players left from that team. So why does that season still matter? 2015, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, none of those seasons should matter anymore. In recent seasons, this is what Notre Dame has established themselves. They are consistently this. And I think that should be what we're standing on. By the way, so here we go. Brian Denbo, speaking on the offensive line, how close do you think they are to knowing whom the starters are, and will they keep that info close to the hip once they know? Probably. But I mean, I think we'll start to see things come out soon. I mean, look, we already know 4 starters. I think there's only really a question of 1. We know Blake Fisher's going to start. We know that Josh Lugg's going to start. We know that barring injury, Zeke Correll is going to start. We know Jarrett Patterson's going to start. I think the only question at this point in time, Brian, is who's the 5th starter going to be? And then is Blake Fisher going to be left tackle, right tackle? Is Josh Lugg going to be a tackle or guard? Where's Jarrett Patterson going to play? But there's no question about who's going to start, just maybe where. Gregory Nielsen says, I have less concern about Blake Rocco starting and more concern over them holding up for 750 snaps over the year. I think coaches will have to be disciplined about rotating to preserve them. I think that's a legitimate concern for Blake Fisher just because he's a bigger kid. But I think that is also a reason, to your point, Gregory, why I would love to see a rotation at guard with Blake Fisher, with Rocco Spindler, and Andrew Kristofic. I would love to see them do with that position what we saw them do in 2017 with Harry Heastan when we looked at the rotation of Tommy Kramer and Robert Hainsey. Then there's 2 reasons for that. One is kind of what you point to. Number 2 is improves development. And then number 3 is you're going to lose Jarrett Patterson most likely after this year. Now you're stepping into you're going to lose Josh Lugg, whereas next year you're not going to have to replace either one of them necessarily with a inexperienced player. You're going to have 2 guards that have played a lot of snaps. And I think that certainly would help them quite a bit. And I'm also not someone who believes that they should go after the transfer from Marshall. I don't think that they should do that at all. I think, yes, he's a very good college football player. Do I think he necessarily moves the needle on the offensive line? No, not really. And yes, he was very good at Marshall. I think he's a big, strong, physical kid, not overly mobile or athletic. The other thing that I would say is if he was that good, that he was going to be as good as the guys that Notre Dame just lost, or potentially as good as the Notre Dame guys have coming back, he would not be transferring to Florida State or Notre Dame as a 6th-year senior. He'd be in the NFL right now. He would have gone to the NFL, been drafted on day 2, and that's where he'd be. But he's not that kind of player, which is why I think I would rather have to develop young linemen to get ready to play Florida State, Toledo, and Purdue than I would have to worry about trying to build a new starting lineup for next year when you start the season off with Ohio State. I think that would be a mistake by Notre Dame's part. And it's one of those ones where you almost kind of hope he picks another school because then you almost want to protect them from themselves. It's kind of how I look at it. I don't know how to take this one, Brian Denbo. Brian, I can be your redneck alter ego. Brian's help Brian's. So I let me see you give a shot at being my redneck alter ego. I'd love to see what that would look like. Notre Dame 2164. I have some concerns about some of the receivers. Maybe I'm wrong, but I've seen way too much potential, not enough production on the field. Hopefully scheme and philosophy will help some of that. Honestly, for me, I understand where you're coming from, but I think the lack of production has been a lack of opportunity. When Braden Lindsey's been healthy and on the field, he's produced. When Lawrence Keys has been on the field and been a part of the offense, he's produced. Kevin Austin hasn't produced. Avery Davis has produced. And also Michael Mayer's part of the pass game too. I think the concern I have at receiver, which is a legitimate concern, is more about, for me, it's more about health and system than it is about the talent. And I also think that receiver is one of those positions where I don't really care what you did before. I don't think look, Notre Dame puts a whole lot more emphasis on experience than me or Alabama or Clemson or Ohio State. I mean, even at Notre Dame, when Brian Kelly has been forced to play young players, we've seen them produce at a high level. It's just in other years, they just don't get that opportunity. Brian Denbo says, is there any truth to the Clemson players complaining about how hard Notre Dame was hitting and that they kept hitting? I haven't heard that. It wouldn't surprise me. I do know that Clemson is a program that respects Notre Dame very, very much, and that goes all the way back to 2015. I think I've said this before on this channel, but I was told by some of my friends in the coaching world that Clemson, when they looked at the playoff field in 2018, they viewed Notre Dame as their biggest competition. That was the team they were most concerned about because they saw how good that defense was. And they saw how good some of the skill players that Notre Dame has, Dexter Williams and Chase Claypool, Miles Boykin, Alizé Jones, that concerned them. And remember, Notre Dame had some impressive victories over ACC teams. I mean, Clemson barely beat Syracuse, and Notre Dame beat the mess out of them. Notre Dame beat the heck out of Virginia Tech that year. Notre Dame smacked some of those ACC teams pretty good in 2018. So I think they have a great deal of respect for Notre Dame, especially the line and the defense. Do I think that would they complain about it? Maybe, but I do know that Clemson respects Notre Dame and the way that Notre Dame plays the game. There's no question about it. Tyler Almani says, what game on the 2021 schedule is the biggest obstacle for Notre Dame? Honestly, I'd say probably Cincinnati. And the reason for that is I don't know if Cincinnati has the best team that Notre Dame's going to face. My big concern about that game is that it is Cincinnati and that the Notre Dame players, there's a concern that when you play a team that's not Georgia, Alabama, they maybe overlook them a little bit. And that's why that one concerns me a little bit. It really does. Notre Dame 2164. Is it odd that I'm not worried about Blake Fisher and Rocco Spindler starting for us, especially since they are freshmen? I wouldn't say it's odd. I'd say it's pretty hopeful. I think my concern isn't so much that they start. I just don't want them starting next to each other. That's my only big concern that I have. Brian Denbo says, if Coach Freeman went anywhere else, there would be different articles written. I agree with that. I think there's some truth to that. I do. I think there still very much is a Notre Dame. I didn't used to believe this has existed, but I've come to there's just too much evidence for me to not believe that there isn't that now. Tyler says, they are talented, but I do expect growing pains. What's your reasons for not being worried? I'd personally like Rocco to slide to right guard, so he's between Lugg and Zeke. Then Fisher has it'd be Patterson as help. And Tyler, you and I, and he knew that he spelled that wrong. You and I are on the same page there. It's not so much that I'm worried about them starting, although I would like to see the rotation. But the rotation isn't because I don't trust Rocco. It's just that he is young. It's a way to manage his snaps. It's a way to keep more guys fresh. And then if something happens at tackle, Andrew Christophic's played tackle his whole career. You could then maybe slide him out to tackle, and you've had an experienced guy stepping in there if that were to happen. So that's why I'd like to see them develop more than just the starting five. And I think a rotation with Rocco and either Christophic or Quinn Carroll would be the way to get that done. No question about it. JJ Goodway asks, will the Irish Breakdown site have a message board again at some point? I'm trying. I mean, this has been a battle for me for about 6 months. And I'm being told that we're going to have one. I'm told we're going to have one at some point in time this summer. When that date is going to be, I don't yet know. I've actually had my wife start looking into creating a message board that just be independent of it. I'm still trying to give SI the opportunity to get it done. They say that commenting in the articles is going to be back soon, but to me that's not the same as a message board. So I fight that battle on a weekly basis. And I will say this, JJ, is join our Irish Breakdown group on Facebook. What I would like to do in the meantime, and I know not everybody has Facebook, but what I have really tried to do, and we've grown to over 1,000 people after not having that group, and I'm going to leave it in the chat at the bottom. I just post the link to it. But look, we can talk, we can debate. I will go there. I'll answer your questions. We can engage. We can talk football. We can talk college football. We can talk Notre Dame football. It's different, and I put all my stories on the Facebook group page. So if you go to our Facebook group, you're going to see all the stories that I publish are going to be there. All of our podcasts are there. All of our videos are going to be there. And then we can still talk. We can still engage. You can ask questions. I'll answer questions. But as far as an official message board that's a one-stop shop, because that's not the ideal way. The Facebook thing is not the ideal way to go. But it's kind of like trying to make the best of what we can deal with right now. Joseph Wan, I think the worrying thing is that players that have been developed for a couple of years can't beat out freshmen. I agree. I think that's my big concern in the offensive line is I would phrase it differently because I don't think they have been developed. I think that's the bigger issue. When did Andrew Kristofic get developed? What playing time did he get the last 2 years? Then in the beginning of spring practice this year, he's moving back and forth from center to guard. A guy with almost no experience is moving back between center and guard. He can't get comfortable one position. That's not a recipe for success for a guy like that. All right. Jay Wiki Jr. says, we're beating Wisconsin and USC for sure. I'd be surprised if Notre Dame lost either one of those teams. I really would. Tommy Leonard says, I don't think depth recruiting has been great since Harry's second to last year. The top two or so were really good, but after them, so even Harry Heastand's last class wasn't great top to bottom. And that would be the Jarrett Patterson class. That was just not a normal Notre Dame class. Jarrett Patterson was actually recruited after Harry left. Now, having said that, if Harry didn't leave, they would have got the kid from Ohio State, Nicholas Pettit-Friere. They would have got him. There's no question about it. I know people in Ohio State that will say that. So that they would have at least had him, but Jarrett Patterson's on right now, at least on that same level. The 2019 class was really good. They just haven't developed it. Part of that's injury to Quinn Carroll, but Quinn Carroll, Zeke Correll, Andrew Kristofic, that trio was really good, and they just haven't developed it yet. And that's more of a coaching development issue than it is, to me, a player issue. And look, we have yet to see, and this is what Vince and I said at the very beginning of the offseason, this is going to be the first true Jeff Quinn offensive line. Last year's offensive line still had as much of Harry Heastand's DNA on it as it did Jeff Quinn's. That's just a fact. Number one, Harry Heastand recruited for the 5 starters. He coached for the 5 starters for at least a year, had a relationship with those guys for a time. And last year they had Chris Watt, who was very close with Coach Heastand and was very much a Harry Heastand disciple, which is why he's now at Tulane with Chip Long, who is very close with Harry Heastand. Harry Heastand and Chip Long have always been very close since they started working together, and that's where that relationship came from. Richard Robinson, a lot of young, unproven talent, think they can win them all if they play well, could also lose to. I think a New Year's Six is probable. I'm leaning more towards the New Year's Six than I am the playoff because there are some things that need to get worked out. And as I've said, going undefeated is tough. Tommy Leonard says anything less than the New Year's Six Bowl would be disappointing. I agree with that for sure. Four Horsemen says SP Plus for sure seems to have a bad read on Notre Dame right now, but it has proven to perform well against Vegas over the years. I don't care about Vegas. Vegas is not meant to be predictive of what's going to happen. Vegas is meant to how can I best generate betting on both teams. Fact. I mean, this is S&P Plus after the playoff in 2019 had LSU behind Clemson and Ohio State. It's not a good formula. It's just not. And I don't care about Vegas. Betting is different than football. It just is. And if you're going to tell me that North Carolina should have been ranked ahead of Notre Dame last year, which in their formula it was, I can't respect that. If you're going to tell me that Penn State at 4-5 for whatever efficiency standard was the 17th best team in the country, I can't respect that. They had Notre Dame behind Michigan almost the entire 2018 season, despite the fact that Notre Dame beat Michigan. It wasn't until Michigan lost to Ohio State that they finally fell behind. So I can't do it. I just can't do it. And look, I get this. Brian touched on this earlier, but SP Plus is entirely based around a formula, which I explained in my article. He doesn't use his numbers to inform his rankings. He has a formula that spits out the rankings. That's not accurate. Conley doesn't use his numbers to inform his rankings. He created the formula. The formula is man-made. You can't blame it on a computer. You're the one that creates the criteria for those rankings. It is, and here's the other part of it. When your rankings consistently just say dumb things, so again, one time in Brian Kelly's tenure has the S&P Plus had Notre Dame ranked higher than 12. This is something that Bill Conley talked about in his breakdown. One time. Not the 2012 team, not the 2017 team, not the 2018 team, not the 2020 team. Not one. Just the 2015 team. That's it. Your formula stinks when it says despite LSU going undefeated, beating 7 top 15 teams, I think 5 top 10 teams, beating Clemson convincingly, beating Alabama, beating Oklahoma by like 40, and then beating, like I said, Clemson, who then beat Ohio State, and you still have LSU ranked behind Ohio State and Clemson, there's something wrong with your formula because it says it's predictive. Well, you didn't predict that very well, did you? So I can't deal with it. I can't deal with it. It's no. And it says, here's what it says too. You can ride this horse as long as you want, but it's going to be a losing battle. For instance, in 2016, SP Plus said Notre Dame was much, much better than their record. It had Notre Dame in the top 25, I believe. Despite the horrible record, it's not resume-based. It's supposed to be predictive. That's the whole point. It didn't predict it because Notre Dame was 4-8. You can say they should have. They were 4-8. That's what they were. They lost to a 4-8 Duke team at home. They lost to a 3-9 Michigan State team at home. They lost to Navy. If it predicted them to be better, then it clearly is a flawed predictive because they were 4-8. And that's my whole point. It's supposed to be predictive, but it's not. It's reactive. He says it's predictive, but it's reacting to the data that it already has. Because from a predictive standpoint, it's useless. Because if you're going to try to tell me that there's any formula that should tell you that, again, you have to be, when it's a man-made formula, and it consistently produces stupid things like let's have LSU behind Ohio State and Clemson after the season is over, then you have to be willing to look back to your formula and say, there's something clearly flawed in this formula. When you have teams with a losing record ranked at right below Notre Dame who went to the playoff, then your formula stinks. And that's what it is. Elijah Mills says, I don't understand why the media always hypes up USC and especially Texas. And they do it with Michigan too. It drives me nuts. Technical technician coaching, all joking aside, how enormous would the galactic explosions be if Notre Dame were to win national championship? I predict all their negativity would be replaced by complete bootlicking for dollars. Don't disagree at all. Don't disagree at all. Tommy Leonard says, part of me wants to see Notre Dame sign a deal with BSPN just to see the 180 that would be done by that company in favor of Notre Dame. We saw that this year when Notre Dame went to the ACC. We already started to see that. All righty. All right, Chris Dunn says, objectively and on the respect issue, what is Brian Kelly's biggest bowl or postseason win in 11 years? We need to prove it on the field and people will shut up. See, I can't go with you all the way there, Chris, and I understand where you're coming from, but number one, this isn't about bowl games for Notre Dame specifically. What's North Carolina's big bowl win? What's Iowa State's big bowl win? Okay, answer that, and then we can talk about why Notre Dame is ranked ahead of those teams. Like, so your comment, Chris, is if Vince and I were arguing that Notre Dame should be ranked ahead of Georgia or ranked ahead of Ohio State or ranked ahead of Alabama or ranked ahead of Clemson, we're not saying that. I'm saying they should be ranked ahead of Texas A&M. Well, what's Texas A&M's big win under Jimbo? What, a home win over Florida that went 8-4? Is that bigger than Notre Dame's home win over Clemson? I don't care who they lost. And so to me, we need to have context. We're not talking about being upset with them being ranked below Alabama or Clemson or Ohio State. They should not be ranked above Ohio State. What's Iowa State's claim to fame? And if you want to talk about bowl games, hey, they played not that long ago, and Notre Dame crushed them, right? I mean, let's not forget that. So if you're gonna come at me with that, Chris, then you need to also then explain what about those other teams? What about USC? What about Wisconsin? What about Iowa State? What about North Carolina? What about Cincinnati? All those teams are ranked ahead of Notre Dame in a lot of these projections. And so Notre Dame doesn't have to prove it that they're better than those teams. They've already proven that. They've crushed USC. They've beaten USC 4 of the last 5 times. So what's the justification for having USC ranked ahead of Notre Dame? What's Cincinnati done to justify being ranked ahead of Notre Dame, Chris? What has Iowa State done? What has North Carolina done, who Notre Dame smacked at their place last year? So, again, what's the context of what we're discussing here? It's where Notre Dame is ranked relative to those teams, not Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State. You're talking about a different conversation, and I get where you're coming from. If we're having a national championship conversation and Notre Dame was picked to finish, has less odds than Ohio State, Clemson, Alabama, and Georgia, Oklahoma. I say, okay, yeah, Notre Dame should be ranked below those teams because of what they're proving it. But then to say they're below Iowa State, below North Carolina, below, I mean, all these others. It's just that to me is where it is our pushback and where I can't go there with you on that. Robert says, what would be better for the program next year? Win a playoff game but lose by 30 in the title game, or a 30-point win in New Year's Six Bowl against the fifth-ranked team in the country? I think it's the latter. I'd be curious to get everybody's opinion on this, but for me, it's the latter. I think a playoff game win, but getting blown out in the title game does nothing for Notre Dame. It's because no one's going to talk about the playoff win. All they're going to talk, like, they won't get the credit for the playoff win the way that Ohio State is this year. They just won't. Now, going to, let's just say, so to put some specifics on this, Robert, let's say Notre Dame does not make the playoff. So let's say that in the first scenario, Notre Dame makes the playoff, they beat Oklahoma in the semifinal, and then lose to Ohio State by 30. I don't think they get any credit for beating Oklahoma. If it's the other way around, they beat Ohio State, who's a good team, or Clemson, but then lose to Alabama by 30, I don't think they get a whole lot of credit for that. Now, let's say they go to, let's say, the Sugar Bowl, and they beat, or the Orange Bowl, and they beat Georgia. Or let's say Ohio State doesn't make the playoff either. It's just possible. And let's say they play Ohio State in a bowl game, Cotton Bowl, and they beat them by 30. Or they beat Oklahoma by 30. Or they beat Clemson by 30. Or Georgia by 30. As long as it's that kind of fifth-ranked team, then yeah, I think Notre Dame is going to get way, way, way more respect. The caveat, however, is if they're playing a top 5 team that doesn't have the national prestige. So let's just say Iowa State has a big year and they're as good as people say and they're ranked 5th. Notre Dame beats them by 30. No one's, Iowa State was overrated. They shouldn't have been ranked that high anyway. If it's a Coastal Carolina type of team or a UCF or a Boise State in all those years, they won't get the credit. It has to be a big-time program. It has to be a Florida, a Georgia, an Oklahoma, a Clemson, a Bama, and Ohio State. It has to be that. It can't be Penn State. It can't be Oklahoma State. It can't be even Texas A&M. It has to be one of the true big boys, in my opinion, for that to count. All right, here's a question that we were talking about earlier. Jack Foot said, is it concerning that we, O-Line U, are looking at a 6'2 guard in the transfer portal? Sure, we're replacing 4 starters, but they have 2-3 years of experience, and that should be enough to develop the next guys. I agree with you. Now, he's a second-team All-American by Athlon, but that's for what he did in the MAC. I've watched a little bit of film with Kane Madden, who's what we're talking about. He's a big, strong, tough kid, more big this way than big that way. But to me, Notre Dame should never be in a position where that's the kind of grad transfer they're taking. And as I'll say again, if he was that good of a player, he would not be coming to Notre Dame or Florida State as a 6th-year senior. He'd be in the NFL. That's just a fact. Okay. All right. Caleb Collins says, June 1st, dead period's officially over, and that's going to be the topic of conversation tomorrow. We're going to have 2 recruiting shows tomorrow. We're going to have at 1 o'clock, we're going to talk about just how big this month is. I think this is the biggest recruiting month in Notre Dame history under Brian Kelly, and we'll talk about why that is the case. All righty. And let's get to Facebook. I want to see who is asking this question here real fast. This question is coming from Tom Burke. So Tom Burke asks, I've been a Notre Dame fan since 1960. Can anyone tell which year Notre Dame's been overrated by the national media going into the season? Very few. I agree. Yeah, I agree. It doesn't happen very often. Jack Foot, do certain coaches realize that they have developmental issues and try but don't always succeed at addressing them, or do they not realize it, ignore it, and stay the course they are on? Sadly, the tendency under Brian Kelly has been to stay the course. I think that's especially true when talking about Jeff Quinn. I don't think Brian Kelly is in the same planet as me and a lot of people that I know that know how to evaluate offensive line. That they'll tell you that the job he has done has not been to the standard of what we see coaches like Kurt Flood at Alabama or the guy at Oklahoma or coaches like that. It's not to the same level of the technique, the force, the power. And the one year that we saw it under Jeff Quinn, I don't think it's a coincidence that it happens to be the year where Harry Hiestand disciple was on the staff. He's got a lot to prove this year. There's no question about it. Now, if they take a big step back, then that's going to raise major cause for concern. If they're still really good in a top 10 unit, then I think he starts to deserve a lot of credit. All right. David, I'm not going to dive into the Chip Long stuff. That's going to take us on a completely different topic. I'll tell you what, if you want to answer that question, hit me up on Twitter and we'll discuss it privately. It's just, I don't really kind of like getting into that. And then the response to it about it on here is just absolutely 100% false. And it's exactly why I don't care to get into it, because people are going to have their opinions, and most of the strongest opinions about why Chip Long left are uninformed opinions or slanted opinions. So get the last couple questions here. Michael Morris, what do you think we need more in this recruiting class, top safeties or top corners? Well, I think in this particular class, it's top corners because there are more top corners than top safeties. It's a better cornerback class than it is a safety class. But Notre Dame needs a top safety or two in this class. I think more corners is, from a volume standpoint, is needed. So if we're going to put a plural on it, I'd go with cornerback. If you could say I could have one elite safety or one elite corner in this class, I probably would go with safety. Elijah Mills says, I think Iowa State got more respect because of their wins over Oklahoma, Texas, and Oregon last year with how those schools are viewed by the national media. And I think you're right, Elijah, but I think that's the problem. I mean, Iowa State beating Oklahoma has happened before. They beat them in, 2018, right? 2017, one of those years. They beat Oklahoma. That's not a surprise. And Oregon, to me, no one should view Oregon with any respect last year. Oregon was a very mediocre football team last year. They won the Pac-12 title over a average USC team. They shouldn't even been in the Pac-12 title. It's because Washington, I believe, had to bow out because of COVID. They were a very mediocre team, and that was a mismatch in the bowl game. Also, Oregon had a lot of players sitting out that year. I mean, Penei Sewell didn't play last year. There was a couple DBs didn't play last year. So Oregon was not a very good football team last year. Texas fired their coach. I mean, that's not an impressive win. And then, of course, Oklahoma got a rematch against Iowa State in the Big 12 title game and beat them. It was a much more competitive game than what we saw with Clemson. But, I mean, I understand why. They also have a lot of experience coming back, right? Brock Purdy comes back. Breece Hall comes back. Charlie Kohler comes back. Mike Rose comes back on D. I mean, they have a lot of guys coming back. But, again, a lot of guys coming back from a program that has never done what they're predicting them to do. That's my big issue. Could they do it? Maybe. But I have a hard time predicting that. So that's going to be it for the questions. And as D-Rock reminds you, hit the like button. Hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell. And I always appreciate that. I appreciate the support. If you like this shirt, if you like this hat, or this coffee mug, these are all things that we sell in our merch store. So we've had a lot of success with that so far. You can find the link to it below. It's just store.irishbreakdown.com. You can see all of that. You can obviously support our channel at irishbreakdown.com, which I always appreciate. Reading our website on a daily basis is still the best way to help support us and help us grow. That is still our number one revenue stream for Notre Dame. So for Notre Dame football and our coverage. But obviously, we're continue to grow our YouTube channel. And if you you can keep on the Chip Long stuff. They're not 100% accurate because I guarantee you I know a lot more people associated with the program than you do, and that's not accurate. So if he was so despised by people in Notre Dame, why in the world did Chris Watt just decide to go work for him? So don't come here with that stuff, all right? We're not going to deal with that here. But make sure you're checking out our channel. Make sure you're sharing our stuff with your friends. If you have other Notre Dame family or friends, share our YouTube channel with them. Share our website with them. You can also find the link to our newsletter, our daily newsletter below. And we also launched a Patreon page here that we're working on and growing too. So appreciate everybody. I hope everybody had a phenomenal Memorial Day weekend. I hope that you had a chance to remember what yesterday was about. Someone who comes from a strong military family going all the way back to World War II. Yesterday is one of those great days for me where you really think about just the sacrifices so many have made for our country. And it was very nice. It was very nice to to sit back and think about those family members and just what that day meant. And tool worker, I got your question. I didn't take that as disrespectful to me. I just think your opinion about Chip Long and the situation is just wrong. That doesn't mean I dislike you. You've asked some great questions, and we love the fact that you're part of the channel. So you being an appreciated part of our community does not mean always agreeing with me or even always being right. So I didn't take it as disrespect. You're just wrong on this particular topic. And I have text messages from players to prove that you're not right on this subject. So, and that's where we're coming from. So anyway, it was a fun show. I'm curious to hear what your opinions are. Let us know in the chat below. Let us know if you weren't part of the live show. If you're listening now, let us know. Do you think where do you think Notre Dame should be ranked? What are your biggest concerns about this Notre Dame football team? And let's try to stick to the rational stuff, not the S&P plus stuff, because that is the outlier. That, to me, is not to be taken seriously. And I guarantee you the predictive nature of that will not turn out to be true in 2021. So at least in regards to Notre Dame. So everybody have a great rest of your day, and we'll be back tomorrow to talk recruiting. Both shows tomorrow are going to be about recruiting. So have yourselves a great day, and we'll talk to you all again very, very soon.